Thanks for joining us at the 2025 Commons Journal uh, conference, annual conference. And I'm going to be moderating this first panel, which is entitled Unmaking Europe, Borders, Displacement and Citizenship. My name is Daria Saburova, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at Central European University. Um, and so in this panel, we will explore the tensions at the core of the European project between the promises of inclusion, human rights, democracy, and on the other hand, the exclusionary practices of border regimes, deepening inequalities, unequal exchange, etc. And ultimately, we will ask the question whether Europe can still be a space of transnational solidarity, or will it merely function as a supranational entity that reproduces the structures of inequality and exploitation that shaped its colonial and imperial past? And for Ukraine specifically, we will try to reflect on the question whether in which sense Europe can represent an alternative to Russian imperialism. So this panel brings together wonderful scholars specialized both in internal and international migration and theorists. So all of our participants actually are closely connected to questions of citizenship and migration and thinking about national and transnational projects. First, we will start with Alexandra Tarkhanova, who is a research associate at the University of St. Gallen. She has conducted extensive field work with internally displaced persons in Ukraine, but also with Ukrainian refugees abroad since the start of the full-scale invasion. She approaches these questions from the critical citizenship perspective. We will then listen to Daria Krivanos and Elisa Pascucci. So Daria Krivanos is a sociologist specialized in international migration, especially from the post-Soviet space to Europe, which she approaches from a Marxist feminist framework of social reproduction. She is a researcher at the University of Helsinki. And Elisa Pascucci, who is a senior researcher at Tampere University in Finland and affiliated to the University of Bologna. She specializes in human geography and migration studies, especially in politics of migration and humanitarianism in Europe and the Middle East. And finally, Etienne Balibar, a philosopher, professor emeritus of Paris-Nanterre University, who has authored numerous very important books, but has been also preoccupied these last few decades with the questions of citizenship, migration, and the European cosmopolitan project. So among some of his books, there are We the People of Europe, Europe Crisis and End, always with a question mark at the end, citizen subject, etc. Also, we are very honored to have him here because he has lately written a lot both on Ukraine and Palestine, which is going to be very interesting for our discussion. I would like to ask the first. So we're gonna have a set of questions, and then if you would like to ask some questions, we will have some questions from the audience. You can write them in the Q&A. And also, very important detail, we are very lucky to have two interpreters with us today. So Victoria and Ivan, they will be doing a simultaneous translation from English to Ukrainian. And if you would like to have the Ukrainian translation, sorry, I should have said it in the beginning, you can click on plus and you have interpretation and you can click on Ukrainian. Якщо ви хочете український переклад цієї панелі,
If you
ви
need
можете
Ukrainian
нажати на
interpreting, please
плюс
click on
і на
plus button
переклад
and then turn on interpreting function. You may listen to the simultaneous interpreting of this panel.
Okay, so the first question, and I think that when constructing this panel, I was thinking that very often internal migration and international migration are disconnected. So there's a kind of like a division of labor between the sociologists who specialize in international migration and internal migration. And this seems to be related to the fact that although migration has gained a very important place in political, social theory, social sciences, it is the international migration from global south to global north that has attracted the most attention from researchers, especially in Europe. But the internal migrants who live who live less often in camps and who are concentrated in developing countries, they form kind of like the invisible majority of forced migrations. However, what is often overlooked is that internal and international migration and displacement are closely connected in the concrete experiences of the people who seek better economic opportunities or who flee ecological crisis and military violence, as in the Ukrainian case. And also the fact that internal displacement also produces unequal access to citizenship, which might be counterintuitive on the first glance. Because the situation of internally displaced persons seems to differ from international migrants because it theoretically involves the enjoyment of citizenship rights. However, in the material and sometimes even in legal terms, internally displaced persons find themselves in similar conditions to those of the people displaced abroad. For both of these reasons, I think that these questions of internal and international migration cannot be treated separately. And this is why we invited Alexandra Tarhanova to talk about these questions. So, Alexandra, how would you explain the ongoing social and political marginalization of internally displaced people, or for whom you use such terms as semi-citizens or second-class citizens? In the absence of articulated collective struggle for their rights, what strategies do people use to contest their position in the society? And finally, would you say it is important to talk about internal and external migration together, and why?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, Daria, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel, and also thank you for these questions. I think they're very thoughtful and important questions. And I will allow myself to start maybe at the end, since you already kind of gave the introduction to this topic. And you're absolutely right that internal displacement and international migration are addressed often separately, both in political discourse and humanitarian work and in academic literature. And it is, in a sense, a political issue. So migration across borders, international migration, is problematized in political discourse from destination, so-called destination countries, right? So from the end. And not accidentally, these destination countries are also the countries that continue to be places where legitimate knowledge on international migration is produced from. Hence, this topic becomes more of an issue, more of a problem, and it gains some bigger prominence in academia, right? In academic discourse. Internal displacement, however, remains in purview of often actually anthropology, of course, also international humanitarian organizations and humanitarian work, but more often in anthropological writing, less so in sociological, and almost never in political science. Given that we live in this system, international system of nation-state borders, nation states are expected to control and contain its citizens, to also take care of them, to protect them to an extent. That is why international migration becomes this abnormality, becomes this problem, right? And that is also why internal displacement, in a way, means that the issue, in quotation mark, is contained within the nation-state borders, right? Even though the nation-state is the same nation-state that is often implicated in whatever the reason is for the internal displacement to begin with. To a different extent, in different role, but that's often is the case. So in a way, what we're talking about here is the problem of people out of place or of people on the move. Both internally displaced people out of place and internal migrants, as you said, do face or do have similar experiences, or maybe the kind of experiences that can be analyzed together. They're not exactly the same, but we can, and in my opinion, should look at them together. And these are, as you said, socioeconomical deprivation and socioeconomic struggles with housing, with income, employment, education of children, and so on, but also to an extent, in different contexts, an experience of othering, of marginalization, of even discrimination. And if when it comes to migrants, we talk about the violence of European border regime. When it comes to internal displacement, it is often conditions of humanitarian crisis that people are living under in the so-called global South and global East. So as a sociologist who is interested in relations between the state and its citizens, and these relations could be, relations of control and regulation and governance, but also relations of protection, assistance, welfare, and kind of emotional attachment to the state of your citizenship. Given that, there are two questions that I'm interested in, and looking at the two kinds of displacement and two populations allow me to explore these questions. So first one would be, it allows me to see how states administer people out of place, right? The extent to which it is actually the function of the state to fix a person in place. So we could see how residence registration impacts people's access to social rights, to citizenship rights, to social entitlements, to services, and so on. So, for example, in the case of IDPs in Ukraine, since 2014, they have experienced what I call and others call in literature hyper-documentation. So the fact that they face administrative and bureaucratic obstacles to gain access to their citizenship rights. And often what might look from outside as just another bureaucratic procedure is experienced by people as a type, as a tool for marginalization. So that's what comes out in interviews with IDPs, particularly not in the acute stage of displacement, but in a protracted stage of displacement. When it comes to the Ukrainian refugees, in my view, it looks to me right now the Ukrainian state is still trying to figure out the kinds of tools that it can use to maintain the relations with its citizens abroad, but also to the extent to which it can also control or influence them, right? So I'm not yet sure how it is going to develop. And the other reason, which is very important and kind of more conceptual reason why I think that it is important to address these two topics together, is the fact that it allows me to show how citizenship is an insecure status, like ontologically, fundamentally an insecure status. It is afforded by nation states, right? It's in depth connected to the nation state. We know nation states are insecure entities. They go through crises, they can become occupied, they enter large-scale wars, and so on. And one conclusion of it is to say, well, okay, citizenship is an insecure status. What do we do then? And many would say, okay, human rights is the way to go, but we unfortunately know that human rights is much weaker institution than citizenship rights are. Hence, citizenship rights is for most people is the way to access services, rights, entitlements, assistance of any kind. So what it shows actually is that citizenship becomes this, doesn't become, it is a institution with internal structure. So that is what you mentioned, like semi-citizen, non-citizen, quasi-citizen, conditional citizen, and so on. So by looking at people who have been displaced internally or externally meaning that if they enter citizenship relations with potentially another state, what I see is how people experience and navigate the changes in their citizenship status. Not whether they're a citizen or not, but rather the changes within the internal structure. So how do, to be more exact, like how do IDPs in Ukraine, for example, experience and navigate this moment when their citizenship all of a sudden became conditional on something, or when it is experienced as a diminished citizenship, a loss of something. So I think that already sort of describes or answers also your first question, why IDPs also continue to face discrimination and marginalization in many cases. I am still a little bit hesitant to go in depth or to draw generalized conclusions from my current project on internal displacement and citizenship relations of internally displaced people in Ukraine right now, post-2022, just because we are a little bit too early in the process for me to draw general conclusions. But what I can say is that given that currently there is like a more acute stage of displacement, and given that the war is ongoing, people do have, or kind of the biggest problem that they voice to us in the interviews is housing and just basic security of their livelihoods when it comes to income and employment. This remains the biggest issue. And the hyperdocumentation, although still a fact, it is less prominent in the narratives of IDPs. So I really appreciated your other question on what do actually people do to counteract this position that they find themselves in, to cope with it, to improve it maybe. And I wanted to mention that when it comes to cross-border large international solidarity around the status of IDP or among the IDP population, of course, you're right, there is a lack of that. However, given that, as I said in the beginning, the issue is contained within a nation state, within nation states, there is solidarity and there is movement and there is collective movement, I would say. And the Ukrainian case is rather illustrative in that, because internally displaced persons have been in Ukraine since 2014, were very active and also successfully active in fighting and securing certain citizenship rights and access to specifically political rights in Ukraine. So I could certainly say that there is an example of an organized movement within this community. In our current project, we are focusing on citizenship practices and acts, specifically with that question in mind. What do people do as citizens and as internally displaced citizens to fight for the citizenship, or more often to reaffirm their citizenship status, to gain access to everything that citizenship is supposed to bring them. And in literature, very often sociologists suffer from the bias of trying to look for individual or collective acts of resistance, right? Which is of course very important, and it tells us a lot about both the resistance and the power structures, but very often what goes missing is continuous reproductive practices that, however, can still bring change. So that's what we are seeing a lot, and that's what we are looking for as well. So the practices of people navigating the state regulations and governance by capitalizing on their citizenship status since they are citizens of Ukraine, reaffirming it, often improving their own situation, but also sometimes improving the collective situation of the group of IDPs as such, using the kinds of resources that are available to them. And here what's important to mention, I think, is that it's not only that individual people have been displaced in Ukraine, often whole networks have been displaced. So people do have access to displaced networks as well, which also then allows them to mobilize resources and change not only their situation, but then potentially also the situation of others. And I'm not going to go into that, but I think anybody who knows anything about activism and volunteering in Ukraine right now also knows that IDPs are a very active part of that, right? A large part, maybe even overrepresented part of volunteers and activists in Ukraine, which then I would say that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to improve the situations of internally displaced persons, but it could mean that. Yeah, so I think that's it from my side. Thank you again for the questions.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. That was really, really interesting, and I think that what you said at the end about the reproductive activities as something that reproductive activities of displaced populations that can help enlarge in our representation of what even politics is, what it is to do politics, is something that is also very present in, I know, in Daria's work, for example. So Daria and Elisa, you both also have a very extensive experience as sociologists working on migration, borders, humanitarianism, and unequal citizenship. So as I already said, Daria has primarily focused on labor migration, but also war-related migration from Russia and Ukraine, while Elisa's fieldwork has mainly taken place in Europe and in the Middle East. From that point of view, one can say that you work respectively with post-socialist context and post-colonial context. However, in your recently edited volume, Europeanization as Violence, and Commons Journal has published the translation to the introduction of your book. You challenge these notions, so the notion of post-socialism and post-colonialism, as well as those like big concepts such as global South against global North and East against West. And you develop a critique of the underlying oppressive dynamics of the European project through an original approach that you call Souths and Easts as method. So what I would like to know is, well, perhaps you could explain to us what you mean by Souths and Easts as methods, maybe to make it a bit more concrete, to use examples from your own fieldwork and from like engaging with the field. How does this approach differ from a classical post-colonial or classical post-socialist approach? And what does it reveal about European borders and migration, and more generally about what Europe represents today as a political project?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Daria, for inviting us to participate in this conference and in this panel. I have been following Spilne for a long time, and it's an honor for us to be here, and we're very happy that Commons also translated the introduction to our book. So to start answering your question, maybe I'll start first with kind of discussing the trajectory of our thinking and the moment from which we were writing the book. So in my own work, I have been thinking a lot about the position of post-socialism and Eastern Europe in the theoretical debates on post-colonial and critical race theory. And my interest does not necessarily derive from some kind of a theoretical curiosity, but more from the empirical engagement with my research interlocutors, who often locate themselves not only in relation to the so-called East-West divide, and we know that maybe this kind of quote-unquote East-West divide is often used as the main kind of analytical axis in the work that we do. But my interlocutors also actively imagined and located themselves in relation to global racial capitalist orders, in relation to other refugees, in relation to other developments in the world. And they would often kind of present themselves as white Europeans in various ways. And even if this whiteness has not always been recognized as full and complete after migration. So that was kind of my own entry point to these debates. And then, as we were working on the volume, the war or the full-scale war in Ukraine broke out, and it raised many public and academic discussions on similar questions, but in particular on decolonization. And there were various efforts to kind of locate Ukraine in this landscape. And there were some takes that if Ukraine can be considered a Russian colony, then decolonized states in the global south, in the so-called global south, would solidarize with Ukraine against Russia as a colonial power. Then there were some voices that would even suggest that Russia offers some kind of an alternative to Western imperial projects. And clearly we all know that Russia does not offer any horizons for collective liberation. And then, as we were working, also the genocide in Gaza started, which is, of course, a kind of acceleration and the continuation of over 70 years of occupational politics. And this genocide was sanctioned and supported by Western states. So, in that moment, we kind of found ourselves in this intellectual landscape, which maybe had some kind of difficulty, or we ourselves wanted to kind of understand how to think relationally about these multiple atrocities that are happening, and kind of how to think about several imperial forms of violence and empires and competing forms of imperialism, and kind of how to think relationally about the overlaps in which imperial powers may work. So then kind of our aim and what we were striving to do in our book, and in this method, South and East as method, we wanted to kind of exit these competing narratives and flattened analogies and write about the production and the simultaneous production of distances and proximities on who is considered to be a human and whose lives matter. And I think this whole idea of who is a human is kind of very central for the understanding of the project of Europeanness. If we look into Europeanness from a post-colonial or decolonial perspectives, because not everyone has been recognized as a human. And what Alexandra just said, that even the whole discourse of human rights and human rights are not always accessible to people. And we can think maybe it's also part of the answer to this question is that not everybody is considered a human. So when we argue in our book that there is this continuous production of multiple forms of difference, multiple distinctions and gradations in relation to the project of Europeanness, and that's precisely through this production of multiple forms of differences, not just kind of an exclusion and inclusion binary, but gradations of Europeanness and gradations of proximity to this project of humanity, which we wanted to capture with South and East as method. And now I think Elisa will add something.
Yes, thank you. Daria Zaburova for inviting us. It's really an honor to be here for me as well. And apologies. I also want to apologize for not being able to attend the rest of the conference, especially tomorrow. It was just not possible to arrange childcare for them. So I'm here for this panel, hopefully for the next today. So I think Daria was speaking quite clearly, I think, and powerfully about the production of difference and also proximity and distance, racialized difference indeed, that we see as in the book. We see that being at the core of Europe as a geographical imaginary, as a political project, and also I would say of the contemporary bureaucratic institutional predicaments of the European Union. And so in this sense, borders, both territorial borders and relational borders, and like all the practices and processes of bordering that shape the lives of people within and outside of Europe are really central to the Constitution. They're really constitutive to this idea and to this project. So we see Europe as something akin to a sort of supranational translation of what Nandita Sharma's diagnostic that national self-determination predetermines hostility towards migrants. And we are aware that this is a rather pessimistic take in a way, but I will come to something that perhaps opens up cracks a bit this before I finish this brief intervention. And going back to South and East as method, I think what it allows us to do is an epistemic position that shed lights precisely on the double movement through which difference and borders produce difference, and bordering takes place. So the simultaneous processes whereby the inclusion of certain spaces and subjects is predicated upon the exclusion of others. And the examples we have in the book include, for example, EU-funded development cooperation for migrant route management in the Sahel, and as well as negotiation of EU accession for countries in South and Eastern Europe that go hand in hand with the development of migration enforcement and reception infrastructures. And in this regard, an objection that we have faced, for example, sometimes from researchers working on migration on the ground, like field workers, is but if you look, for example, at the EU-funded migration governance, say, I don't know, in Morocco or in the Western Balkans, what you will see is it's actually a mess. It's a failure after another, and there are actors on the ground that continues to pursue their own local agendas, and they continue acting in a rather unruly manner and dialectically with these, processes of Europeanization, as we call them in the book. And I would argue that South and East as method is increasingly relational and situated as a method, and our attempt to kind of distance ourselves a bit from bigger overarching narrative was also about capturing these fractures and these cracks that we see. Still, we think that these failures and the unevenness of these processes of bordering are not necessarily they don't mean the end of European power as it is produced through borders and Europeanization. But at the same time, they should be accounted for from, we think, a situated and grounded perspective. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Daria, do you want to add anything or? Okay, good. Thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, maybe I precisely how do you say it? Put too much attention on the binary of exclusion inclusion, and you explained that you're actually talking about these processes of Europeanization and gradation of Europeanness. But Nevertheless, I would say, and Elisa, you actually just said it with also this citation about the fact that national or supranational determination predetermines discrimination against migrants, is a conclusion that seems for the moment quite unambiguous. So the EU project does appear in your volume as intrinsically a neo-colonial or neo-imperial one, where European integration serves to produce new forms of exclusion and hierarchies of whiteness or gradations of whiteness. As for Etienne Balibar, so you have also been preoccupied with these subjects for the last few decades. So the questions of borders, of migration, and of racial and ethnic divisions have been central to your reflections on European citizenship. And I found in your book that you published in French in 2001, translated in English in 2004, We the People of Europe, something which is already connects your reflection to what we just heard from our participants, where you say that, I quote, "The specter of apartheid is being formed at the same time as European citizenship itself. This barely hidden apartheid concerns the populations of the South as well as the East." But at the same time, your work also expresses a continuous conviction or maybe hope that a democratic and federative European project is both possible and desirable, something you further develop in your recent text, The Impossible Possibility of the European Federation, which was also translated this summer for the Commons Journal. So how would you say you articulate theoretically and politically the critique of the European project with the hopes for its future? And what do you think is so unique about this project, if it is?
Thank you, Daria. Thank you so much. Okay, this is big. I'll say again as quickly as possible how grateful I am to you and to the Commons, the journal and the group for inviting me. It means a lot to me in this moment, particularly, of course. And I will try and reflect on the issues that you're raising on the basis of my personal experience, which, of course, is heavily determined, but that could be a plus and not only a minus by the fact that I speak from a very different place, another extremity, I would say, of the European space. I'll come back to that. So you are on the extreme eastern side. We'll talk about that. And I'm on the extreme western side, the Atlantic border of Europe. And also we belong to different generations, which means that we have slightly different experiences. Reacting to your last question and the formula you used, and I have the written version before my eyes. I leave aside the uniqueness of the project. I'd come back to that. But you ask, how do you articulate theoretically and politically the critique of the European project with hope for its future? I'm tempted to give an extremely simple answer. Without critique, there will be no future. So to me, these are not antithetic perspectives or formulas. And of course, the underlying hypothesis or presupposition is that the project, or so-called, but I'll have to come back to that. I'm not sure. I accept the word, but I'm not sure that it's completely clear. So that means that we should not have a representation of this project, this institutional and political project, as something which somehow is on the move, permanently growing, acquiring new horizons and capacities, and so to speak, in its ascending phase. Not even the political leaders, the representatives of I'd say the European political class and technocracy use this language today. Everybody seems, on the contrary, to share the impression that the project, if ever it existed in a single and homogeneous manner, has reached, not only has reached certain limits, but is actually in a kind of existential crisis, I would say. Now, so the problem is not whether a strong project can accept some sort of critique. It's as I said, it's the opposite. It's whether, without a fundamental critique, which hopefully can give way to, excuse me, I haven't been speaking English for some time, can produce also more constructive and perspective and constructive and positive perspectives, the project will reach its limits and collapse. Now, of course, this discourse of the crisis of the European project is something that has existed all the time. I myself I have published different texts and books. You quoted one from 2001. Perhaps there is not a single essay that I wrote on Europe in which I didn't say that Europe is in crisis because of its internal inequalities, because of the tensions between different social and national forces, etc., because of the geopolitical environment. So, in a sense, that could sound like one more repetition of the same. Still, I believe that we can adopt this perspective. Now, that was too long. Allow me to try and tackle or address the questions you raise successively from the two angles. So I will say something, hopefully not too long, about European apartheid, and I will try and say something about the articulation between a European project and the issue of the borders of Europe. So on the side of the apartheid, allow me to return to the circumstances in which I was throwing, so to speak, into the public this provocative formula. At the time, of course, the main reference we had to speak about apartheid was the history of South Africa and its extreme and very brutal form of colonialism, and the way it had been challenged by revolutionary forces. So what I had before my eyes was the situation in France, but also in some other European countries, in which the population of migrants, essentially made of workers, that's very important, at the roots, at the very origins, in a sense, of the European project after World War II, were already workers' migrations, working class. It's very important. If you look at the composition of the working class of a country like France, especially in the eastern region, but not only the miners, the workers of the steel industry, they were all migrants from Italy and Poland. And this played an absolutely crucial role in the social and cultural and political history of France. But now, in the 80s and 90s, the so-called migrants many of whom had French citizenship, but not all, were coming from the former French colonies, Africa and Northern Africa, and their families, of course, as well. So the problem that was discussed on the left, I would say, or perhaps the right, I should say, the radical left, but in a relatively broad sense, was actually a problem of inclusion or incorporation, I would say, of this essential part of the working class into the institutions of citizenship, how to make them full citizens. They were already social citizens in many respects. And so observing the limits, the barriers that the definition of the French nation state imposed on that consideration, on that transformation, many of us had the idea that probably, or possibly, not probably, but possibly, the progressive development of a federal or quasi-European federal political system, of which France, Germany, Italy, etc., would be only a constituent part, would, so to speak, lift the obstacle, because citizenship had to become multinational in its definition, considered as, or supranational, but multinational is more interesting, as a European citizenship added to the national citizenship and, in a sense, prevailing over the national citizenship, which is a relatively utopian view, but was very much inscribed in the political discourses of the time. The argument that we forged was if we are becoming the fellow citizens, we for the French, the fellow citizens of Germans, Italians, etc., not yet Poles at the time, it will be inevitable that we also become the fellow citizens of the workers coming from Africa and North Africa. They're residing on the French territory, they're working, they're taking part in our social fabric, their children are French, and so on and so on. And so what we observed was the exact opposite, of course, as you know. That is, the definition of European citizens that was adopted at Maastricht and in discussions of the time was very strictly and very carefully limited through the adoption of the following rule. A European citizen is, in the first place, a citizen of one of the member states. And that canceled or suppressed every possibility to institute something like a European citizenship. There would be no European citizenship as, for example, in the history of the United States of America, an American citizenship emerged above the local state. And at this point, I introduced, or with some others, the idea of apartheid. I said, within a single nation state, that is France, migrants, even over generations, which is a racial way of categorizing people, are just seen as foreigners. But when the exclusion, the rule of exclusion, is transferred and reasserted at the federal or pseudo-federal level, this becomes a general racial form of exclusion that could be compared to what had taken place in South Africa, which of course provoked a lot of anger and critiques. So yes, I would agree with the idea that at least from the point of view of that aspect of the European construction, but it's crucial and it's central. The post-colonial dimension has continued to operate and has produced, in fact, a new fundamental form of racial exclusion in the broad sense, which you cannot just brush aside or push aside if you want to understand the project. Now, I know I've been too long. I ask the permission to add just a few quick remarks on the other side. Now, this being said, and on this point, I believe we largely agree, or we completely agree. To speak of the European project is at the same time, in my view, useful, of course, but also misleading, because fundamentally, I don't believe that there was ever something like a single European project. I mean, Europe is the qua European Union is, I would say, rather an unstable mixture of two elements. On one side, an institution, and this institution has a history. Of course, it has its successive stages: the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet system, the reunification of Germany and Europe in general, etc. And it's of course essentially relying on certain relationships of forces in which the economic dimension is strongly prevalent, and was itself the point of conflict between antithetic tendencies. I think with others that the turning point is when the French commissioner Delors, who is supposed to have been the great man of this moment, accepted and pushed for the creation of the single European currency, that is the euro, at the coast, and sacrificed what he had always claimed would be the essential counterpart, that is the idea of social rights defined at the European level, and the development of Europe as a social project. So at this moment, what became later very clearly the neo-liberal form of domination, I would say, of our societies and economies, imposed itself within the project. But then, of course, there is the fact that Europe is and remains not so much a project as a problem. And here, because I know I was much long, let me finish with just one a quick remark. We are talking about migrations and we are talking about borders. A third term, of course, which overlaps and combines both, and it's more than ever obsessing us and present in our minds, especially where you have, is war. So what I'm tempted to say is the problem is the following. The way the war evolves at the eastern extremity, that is in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, is going to define and determine the future of Europe, crucially and absolutely centrally. So the discourse we hear today, it's a dominant discourse, etc. It is something like, of course, it's a terribly dangerous situation, but it will have very positive consequences for Europe, because the next step in the formation of a single political entity, that is the military integration, will have to take place, because we need to confront the conflictual situation on our eastern border. I don't believe this is the case. I'm not saying that this will not play an important role, but I'm not going that this is going to solve the crisis. We can discuss, etc. And on the other side, of course, I also believe that the future of Ukraine, and you are better placed than me to talk about that, is completely dependent and is essentially dependent on the forms that the European construction can take now, and whether it is able to overcome its internal crisis or not. It's not just a question of becoming one more member. in an institutional framework that essentially exists and will not change its nature. It will have to change its nature profoundly. Now, I am one of those who, and perhaps this is problematic to say in this context, who believe that the very definition of Europe, as a historical trajectory and trace, and possibly as a future, is at stake in the dilemma whether we think that Russia is part of Europe in a sense, or is the enemy of Europe. Now, I'm not thinking and explaining that we should try and integrate Russia in whichever political form in a Europe federation. I'm just raising the issue whether we see the construction of Europe as the construction. Timothy Garton Ash used that expression recently as a kind of democratic empire, which defines itself in its historical antagonism with the non-democratic empire on the other side. Or we keep thinking one way or another that the history of the civil wars in Europe that include communism and democracy, the East and the West, etc., needs to find some form of democratic and or federal resolution. Okay, I was too long, and I apologize for that. Thank you for your generous attention.
Thank you, Etienne. Yes, you only started maybe developing on what you mean by European federation. Maybe you will be able to come back to that in the other questions. And actually, you also started to answer the next question that I wanted to ask you, because we're talking kind of more generally about Europe, borders and migration, but maybe for our readers and listeners, it might be particularly interesting in how you view Ukraine's European integration prospects. I mean, we can already from what you said kind of deduce what you think, but let's talk about this more in detail, because on one side we could consider these prospects as an alternative to Russian imperialism, or we could also think that Ukraine would simply become, as you said, like another member of the European Union, or even another overexploited periphery of the European Union and the guardian of its border. This is already happening at the Polish-Belarusian border and anticipated in Ukraine with the creation of detention centers for illegal migrants. And actually, with the integration of Ukraine, with the situation with Russia continuing, what we call the militarization of European borders would become like literal, right? So the front line would become the border of the European Union. The issue of forced internal migration is also entangled with that of European integration, I find, in contradictory ways. Because on the one hand, the accession to the EU would require from the Ukrainian state to upgrade some of its standards regarding social, economic, political rights of all of its citizens, as well as minority rights. But on the other hand, the so-called European choice has also led Ukraine to more austerity politics that affect, above all, displaced populations today, producing an exclusion from what one can call the social citizenship. And also, ideologically, the claim to Europeanness, the claim to white Europeanness, tends to exclude various parts of the of the Ukrainian population, such as the so-called backward Russian-speaking Soviet nostalgic people in Ukraine, especially the Eastern Ukrainians, who are today part a large part of the displaced populations, but also the Roma communities and other parts of the Ukrainian population, which can produce a kind of an exclusion from what one might call symbolic citizenship. So what is your view on this question? So how can we think about Ukraine and Europe today beyond this obviously this discourse on Ukraine as fighting for European values?
Are you asking me?
Sorry, I'm asking everyone. No. We can start with Alexandra.
Oh, okay. No, I prefer that. I've already spoken so much. Please, your turn.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for this very complicated and broad question. And I'm afraid that I'm not an expert on this topic. So maybe what I will say will sound naive to an extent, but to me, the diagnostics that you have just described, like what might be in the future of Ukraine, not even if, but kind of on this way of European integration, however it might look and whatever might be at the end of it, or might be promised, or actually at the end of it, these diagnostics to me sounds pretty accurate. It is going to be a military border. It is going to be an enforcer of migration, of the, how do you say that, like European fortress, the external eastern border. It is going to be economically exploited, but the thing is that it is already. So that in a way, Ukraine has been implementing, or it has been at the receiving end of the European neoliberal prescriptive policies since 2014 at least, and had to quite quickly and forcefully implement a lot of what was expected of it through its many iteration of crises, and now it's another one. And it also, it also means that the IDP policies, for example, or more broadly the social welfare policies that also concerned IDP policies have already went through several rounds of neoliberal cuts and restructuring, even not only cuts but really restructuring. So in a way, I feel like, and this might sound naive, and I'm really open to then what other colleagues on the panel will say about that, in a way, Ukraine had the whip, right? And a more complete integration would also include a carrot. And so to me, that's what is missing right now, although we also know that right now social welfare in Ukraine is very much depending on the European finance, on European funding. And when it comes to, and one thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to IDPs is, as I said, it has already went through neoliberal cuts, but Ukraine also has a long history now, unfortunately, and in dealing with displacement, internally displaced people, in developing, reforming, and reforming again the way how Ukraine deals with IDPs. And it is not all roses, but there is also an aspect of institutional learning and improvement, and there's certainly an aspect of very like what Elisa was saying, like on the ground, the bureaucrats, the people who deal with the issue on a daily basis, they have accumulated a lot of knowledge, and there is no country can teach us anything when it comes to IDP policy. That is for sure. The only thing that I think will come is potentially more neoliberal cuts. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not I think there will be no changes, fundamental changes in the future in this process. That would be my view.
Thanks, Alexandra. Daria and Elisa, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I think that it feels that the dominant discussion in Central and Eastern Europe is kind of often quoted in this grand geopolitical and of civilizational terms as a choice between Western and Eastern civilizations, which I think precisely don't capture the production of this class, racialized, and gendered inequalities about which Daria was also speaking, and of course, which are often very essentialist and simplistic, and produce several exclusions of people who will never fit into these narratives. But then I also am thinking more like, what does it mean to think on the ground and think about overlapping forms of violence across like liberal and illiberal democracies alike, which I think is white supremacy, but also the rise of authoritarianism and far-right politics also in Western Europe. And I'm very curious and very looking forward to the panels later today. But also would like maybe to bring to add some complexity on the discussion on Europe and Russia, because quite often I think Europe and Russia are discussed in this kind of antagonizing terms. Kind of Russia is the opposite of Europe, but I think it's also important to think kind of how the project of Russian Empire historically has been based on proving one's Europeanness and one's modernity and belonging to this kind of European family of colonial empires. And if we look into history, so this one's proving of Europeanness and modernity has been based on colonization of indigenous peoples in Siberia, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and there Russian colonizers, ethnographers, anthropologists, that they would position themselves as bringing this project of modernity, progress, civilization to these empty lands inhabited by the so-called primitive people. And it's not only the question of the past. If we look into how in kind of immigration policies in Russia, which have been really intensified raids and deportations from the country, which is becoming increasingly necropolitical. So we see that this is not just a question of the past. So I think it's very important also to look into kind of how we can think of Russia as actually embedded in the European project, if we think of European project as a colonial and imperial project too.
Elisa, would you like to add something?
Maybe just briefly, I'm really not knowledgeable enough on Ukrainian politics and history even to comment about the process of EU integration of Ukraine as such. But I would just like to suggest maybe 2 lines of reflection, because we tend to think about European integration, European accession as a process that then somehow gets done and one is inside, but the production of difference continues also within the EU and within Europe, and there will always be a reckoning and a kind of a continuous, demanded redefinition of Ukraine, Eastern, Western European, not European identity, even after joining the EU. And this we have seen, for example, also, it is also the case, there are a lot of internal differences that are very, very relevant to the project of the European Union, for example, the North and South. So we have seen at work very powerfully, I think, in the 2015 sovereign debt crisis in Greece. There was even there were questions, quite fundamental questions about the economic and political geography of the EU, what is the real Europe, and in terms of monetary and fiscal politics, who are the countries that are actually constituting the core of Europe and who, on the other hand, is lagging behind. And that came with all sort of also, orientalizing tropes and so forth. So that project is never completed in a way, and it's constantly, questioned through the crisis that, as Etienne was saying, that constantly characterizing the European space. Yeah, perhaps this is the most important thing that I wanted to highlight. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Etienne, would you like to add something and also maybe react? Because
Yes.
I find that there are interesting.
Yes. I will try. Cut
Daria.
me as because I really tend to speak too much. Well, three things, if you allow me. First, to Daria in particular, but everybody, in fact, I believe that we essentially agree on certain basic things and ideas. Not only I'm not objecting to the formulas that says that the European construction as it exists, I mean, as it developed over the last decades, includes, of course, a post-colonial and, in that sense, imperialist dimension, which we cannot leave aside when we discuss each and every of the forms that discriminations, ethnic discriminations, and conditions of, as you say, semi-citizenship or second-class citizenship are realized in locally and globally in the European space. That was the meaning of my adopting the category of apartheid. This being said, you return again and again to the name white supremacism. Excuse me, but I don't think this is relevant. I don't think that white supremacism has anything to do with the forms of ethnic or racial, in the broad sense, discrimination that we observe, especially in the eastern part of Europe. Except if you take us further away, as you did a moment ago, and I found that very important when you said, of course, the Russian Empire built itself in the 19th century or since the 18th century and that includes the Soviet Union in many respects, as an imperial project to impose something like a European civilization, therefore implicitly or explicitly white, over racialized peoples of different colors. But if you talk about the small Europe, Central and Western Central and even Eastern Europe, that plays no role. I mean, when we observed different sorts of treatments between refugees coming from the south, sometimes over Belarus, as you know, in a crazy manner, and Ukrainian refugees in Europe, we said something like, okay, the Ukrainians are welcome because they are white, and the Arabs and Turks and Syrians are not welcome because they are brown, something like that. So I think that this is more misleading than anything else. There is a history, a contrasted history of imperialism that, as Hannah Arendt very beautifully explained, includes the colonial empires of the West, who colonized Africa, Latin America, etc., and the colonial empires of and the empires within Europe, which are not colonial in the proper sense of the term, but are multinational and hierarchical. Okay, that's a long history. Second point, I believe that when you say that the militarized border would now or could now perhaps coincide with the front line in Donbass, or a little more oscillating between the positions of the Russian and the Ukrainian armies with supplements from outside. Of course, you are absolutely right. But the question that I want to ask is, which has been strangely left aside, is the militarized border between which forces or entities. And the whole discussion, that's not a critique, it's just a remark, something I want to add. The whole discussion until now, today, has been as if this is a militarized border between the Russian Empire and the European Union, federation or pseudo-federation. Excuse me, there's one term missing in this description, which is the United States of America. And as soon as you talk about NATO and so on, you cannot leave that aside. Now, of course, we've been observing in the last period the very strange game that Putin and Trump are playing, sometimes speaking as if they had one single project in mind, sometimes seeming once again to be on antithetic side. We cannot enter into all these details. When for the first time Putin, we all remember that tragic moment, explained to President Zelensky, you only have to accept Putin's conditions. We agree with him, and he said the only way you have to gain some support from us is to accept that we become the owners or the in control of your minerals, etc. It became clear at this time that something like a new Yalta was on the table. That, of course, in a different form. That means that the border is between Europe and Russia, but it is also, and perhaps above all, between America and Russia and Europe as a whole. And Ukraine, of course, in particular, in a sense, already being a part of Europe, are the stakes and the etc. in this game, which is very unpredictable. But that's the geopolitical game, and that's what makes it more dangerous than anything. And finally, I know it was too long, except me. I would say that the integration that you I'm not sure that I don't know enough, perhaps, but I'm not sure that in the question of how to integrate Ukraine into Europe, the problem is something like, on one side, we have a developed social state, economically prosperous Europe, and on the other side, something like an underdeveloped Ukraine, economically, socially, and legally. I'm tempted to think that it is more complex than that. Ukraine is not underdeveloped as compared to Europe. So in a sense, the integration is already taking place. Of course, not at the superstructural level of sovereignty and alliances and federations, but in the sense, yes, that the populations circulate. And the economic and military ties are becoming increasingly strong. So I think that perhaps I don't know if it's too optimistic or too something, but I think that something irreversible has taken place. In fact, Ukraine is already part of something like a European Union or federation. The only question is how this will be negotiated in terms of the legal definitions. And of course, the neoliberal agenda comments all that. The austerity policies are not weighing only on the Ukrainian side, they are weighing also on the European side. Excuse me if again I was perhaps too long and too confused.
No, thanks so much, Etienne. That was really clear. I had another question, but maybe we could also, if somebody wants to ask the question in the Q&A, so that we give some space to our listeners. I don't know, maybe does somebody want to react? You also can ask questions to each other if you want. That's also
I see somebody, but it's in Ukrainian. Probably not Russian, so I can't read it.
No, in the chat it was, we were talking about technical.
In the chat. Oh, okay.
Oh, wait. I lost you. No, that was a screen of somebody's screen. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions for the moment, and but you are really welcome to ask questions. I will ask one last little question. So, what do you think today can a solidarity movement look like between South and East? How can displaced and migrant populations defend their rights today amid the reinforcement of nationalist and authoritarian policies? And what role does Europe or European Federation, as Etienne calls it, play? What role does it play in this? We could do another round.
Can you repeat the last question? I somehow missed it. What role what plays?
What role does Europe or European Federation play in this?
Mm-hmm.
Daria, do you allow me to reverse the order? I would very much like my colleagues to have the last word because I tend to speak. So if you allow me, I'll just give a very footnote on what you said. Yeah, you refer to my permanent use of the category federation. Yes, that is true. But to me, federation is not a clear and simple legal formula. There are many different definitions. It's a problem, and it's, I would say, a principle, perhaps a utopia. So I'm currently trying to work permanently, both in terms of internal structures and in terms of relationships to the outside. And our very discussion shows, and for fundamental reasons, how fragile the separation between the internal and the external dimensions is. So I tend to use the category federation as an antithesis to empire. So then the question becomes, of course, do nations work and think of themselves as imperial nations or as federal nations with respect to their internal multiplicity as well as their combinations with order? One is vertical and hierarchic, that's empire, simple, and the other one is democratic and horizontal. But it's not a solution. It's a problem. In fact, each time we thought, or some of us thought, that the European construction could be pushed one more step into the direction, could advance into the direction of a genuinely federal construction that includes, of course, rights, extended democratic rights for its minorities, its etc. It failed. It failed. So I never speak of Europe today as a federation. I always say that it's a quasi or even a pseudo federation. And that's why asking the question of how to integrate Ukraine into a European federation immediately becomes for me how to transform Europe into a genuine federation. So I stop there.
Yes, thank you, Etienne. Sorry, I wasn't implying that you were talking about the existent legal framework. And I actually, again, invite our listeners and readers to go and read your text in our journal to find out more about what you mean precisely by this term. Does anybody else want to react? Sorry, I muted myself too early. Does anybody else want to react on the question?
If you don't mind, I will express like a slight irritation that I keep on having for years now, and then maybe one answer to your question. So the irritation is really with when we talk about European integration, there is very often, or Ukraine integration of Ukraine, European integration of Ukraine, then there is often there are like remarks and examples or whatever when on the one side Ukraine is presented as integrated, as if it's already Europe. And on the other side, all the ways, reasons, processes that it still has to undergo or still is ahead or failed or whatever. And I just have very personal irritation with this kind when somebody tries to convince me that Ukraine is already European, in this conflictuous, multi-layered, however we want, way, I still feel irritated. So if the front line of Ukraine is already European border or European military frontline, I mean, I think there's so many problems with that I cannot personally agree with this. And then we cannot have that, we cannot assume that's already true and then talk about everything else we talked about today. So that's just a remark. And second, I had a real a hard time coming up with the positive answer to your question, Daria, about the possibility of solidarity or how the solidarity would look like. I rather had a negative example or something that I was very disappointed in the fact that when it comes to Ukrainian refugees and the particular system or status that was implemented, activated for them, the temporary protection status, permit S in Switzerland, where my research is based, how separate that was from other temporary admission statuses in Ukraine, how I think we already talked about it a little bit, how it was presented in the media as something that is afforded to the true victims, to the people that truly need protection, that, and it was sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly a racial discussion, that this a white Christian, mostly women, running away from the unprovoked aggression. And that went together with the fact that there was certain advantage that this status did afford Ukrainians vis-a-vis other people in Europe who also had temporary protection, temporary admission, right? So not asylum seekers, not refugees as such, but for example, Syrians. And that was the case. But I think since then, we know empirically, especially qualitative studies, or at least I can say that convincingly or confidently in the Swiss context, that when you talk to people who have either permit C, so temporary protection, or temporary admission, so Syrians, people from Afghanistan and so on, they remarkably have similar experiences. That of course Ukrainians had a better, easier access to employment, to housing, social welfare, but with time, both groups have hard time in the Swiss labor market. They have experienced discrimination continuously. And what's even more important is that the both statuses are temporary. They are liminal, they're uncertain, they're precarious, they create that. So there was kind of, and now it's very hard to talk about it, both in research, so academically, but also sometimes to practitioners. It's very hard to show and convince people that these are actually just two degrees of the same thing. These are two types of temporary migration status on the provided to the most marginal groups of migrants in the European context, and the so in a way, this is like a lost opportunity for solidarity. So that's why, or I think this is like a manufactured reason why we do not see more solidarity between Ukrainian forced migrants and other forced migrants in Europe. And there are other reasons. There is, of course, like racism in the Ukrainian migrant community. Like we cannot. This is a fact as well. But there are also manufactured reasons, and this is one of those, in my view, manufactured reasons that led to the absence of solidarity movements, projects that would bridge, the Ukrainian refugee community and others in Europe. That's all I wanted to say to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Daria and Elisa?
Yeah, maybe I could start thinking about this question from the perspective of communal labor of care that takes place in migrant and refugee communities, and particularly kind of in the context of kind of heightened anti-asylum and anti-immigration politics. These are the communities and the grassroots collectives that step in and kind of become the shock or crisis absorbers, and this is just an enormous work that is taking place on the ground, and I know many collectives across Europe where people volunteer in the evenings after work and provide different forms of support and counseling to people and helping them to regularize their status. And when we know that in Poland, for example, it is becoming increasingly criminalized, or it has been criminalized at a certain point, like the helping people cross the border with Belarus. Yeah, so I think again we need to kind of look into this communal labor of care. And talking about these forms of solidarity, I think that these are precisely in these spaces that these forms of solidarity can emerge. And again, this is not to romanticize solidarities. I guess there is always this risk of just romanticizing raceless internationalism and as though like solidarities are just so easy. Solidarities take a lot of work, and I think this is through this kind of grassroots work on the ground that maybe these forms of solidarities are already emerging, where people come together in same spaces and, for example, provide counseling to each other in the evenings. And these are very different people who need support. Again, kind of coming back to the question of South and East as method. In one of the grassroots organizations in which I also participate, these are people from Ukraine, Russia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and other non-EU member states that are sharing these spaces and need support in relation to border regimes.
Yeah. Thanks. Elisa?
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps I just can expand a bit on what Daria just said, because I absolutely agree with her that I think there is a lot of solidarity on the ground, but I think in this conjuncture, things are so bleak somehow and so even like dangerous for many of us, especially those that are racialized in certain ways, that even existing and continue to exist and be in the space is a way of somehow challenging the racist and nationalistic politics that are thrown against us. And it's a bit like the question you would ask to queer people or trans people, like we exist and therefore we will challenge this by existing. And that reminded me a bit of what Daria was saying about the work of solidarity. In 2002, I did some field work in Rome in a camp, a camp managed by the Italian Society of the Red Cross for unhoused migrants that are also homeless. And there as well, several Ukrainian young men sharing the space and also cooperating in many ways with people from, a lot of other locations and that experience very different forms of racialization than they do. So this happens all the time. And when we think about Europe, we think a lot about the nation state or the EU, but Europe is also, for example, urban spaces. And it's a history of urban conviviality, of cities that are, by definition, made by migrants through their history. So it's there is also that, and that will continue to exist. And I think that just by staying there, this is a powerful challenge to know this kind of political regressions we are observing.
Thanks, Elisa. We also have two questions in the chat. So one is there is a hope within some of the Ukrainian left-wing socialist organizations that the EU integration of Ukraine could instigate the social transformations, for example, improving of labor rights. Drawn on your insights about the neoliberal course of the EU, is this hope a wishful thinking or indeed a prospect for Ukraine and countries like Georgia and Moldova? Because there is a despair that grassroots movements in Ukraine and even the trade unions are able to push the progressive transformations, and this externalization of pressure for improvements is perceived as the last hope. So kind of if we can't fight our Ukrainian government effectively enough, at least Europe or European integration will help us in that respect. That's the question. So yeah, would you does anybody want to react to that? Because it kind of continues our discussions already, but in from a more precise perspective of the labor organizations in Ukraine.
If I well understand, excuse me, I take it to be, I jump first into discussion. I unfortunately, I would not be optimistic on that. I mean, it would be a complete. It's a paradox. It's a contradiction in terms. To imagine that that integration, to call it like that, of the Ukrainian society and with its social conflicts and traditions into a broader European entity could help grassroots forces, social forces, unions, associations working with the people resist the neoliberal orientations of the state when precisely these neoliberal orientations are winning and in power at the European level as such. But that does not mean I tend to believe that you had to study the question very carefully. That conversely, this integration, again in quotation mark, would mark the beginning of an increased pressure of neoliberal austerity on Ukraine. I tend to believe that it would be the continuation of the same.
If I may add something, so post 2014, if I'm not wrong, it was 2016, 2017. At least very actively, there were discussions in European Parliament on the reform of the labor code in Ukraine, and the main message of those reforms, driven by the European agenda, was liberalization of the Ukrainian labor regulation, which would, in a way, I have to say, bring the existing practices into the light. Right, the practices that are already there, but make them legal. But also it was clear, I mean, the message from the European partners was pretty clear what needs to happen to our somewhat frozen labor code at that point. I don't know what's happening right now but otherwise I completely agree with you, Etienne. I think it's already been happening.
Can I add just one thing to that, Daria?
Yeah,
yes,
sure.
I don't want to be very abstract and enter into considerations of philosophical nature. But still, perhaps this is my old Marxist orientation that speaks here. I mean, we need an understanding of the social history on the two sides over a relatively longer period. So the problem, in my personal terminology, I know it could sound problematic. I would say that what Europe witnessed in the 20th century on both sides of the Great Divide, and especially after World War II, was the construction of what I call a national and social state. That is a state where the national sovereignty is very intimately linked with the development of social rights and compromises, if you like, or agreements, so that the working classes, in a sense, support the nation and the nation is perceived as something that protects the workers and the laboring classes. Now, of course, that took two completely different forms, and in a sense, the protection was more developed, at least for some parts of the population, on the Soviet and socialist side, at the cost, of course, of certain fundamental freedoms and rights. And the protection in the social democratic manner, which was prevalent in the West, was more limited on some aspects and very substantial on others. So the two sides are now coping with these two histories. And the agenda of the neoliberal state on the West, of course, is progressively destroying and dismantling every remain, in a sense, of the social state. But that proves difficult. That proves difficult in every, because of course the bulk of the population is strongly entrenched in these social rights and structures, and because it's problematic to openly declare that the nation is no longer protecting its workers. And in the East, of course, I know the situation less well. I learned a lot from Daria's book, which she asked me very generously to preface, and I have some other sources of information. After the collapse of the socialist regime, the destruction of every form of protection against wild, savage neoliberalism went very fast. The corruption was huge. The transformation into capitalist systems was extremely strong, but not everything was destroyed completely and immediately. And the forms of resistance that you can observe, solidarity that exist in your country, I don't say react if you think I'm wrong, that they are express something like a nostalgia of real existence of communism, but they nevertheless owe something perhaps to the idea that there existed some forms of social protection that we would like to keep, or not to completely be destroyed, etc. So these are two similar and to some extent symmetric problems, but they are not completely identical. And of course, if everything becomes united in this, you observe the same thing in Germany. It's between the East and the West. And as we observe, we know it's one of the roots for very worrying and dangerous political developments in that country. So that could be the case, of course, in other places as well.
Thanks, Etienne. Daria, do you want to add something? Elisa?
I think I will listen at this point more.
We have...
Yeah, me too.
Sorry, we have two other questions. Maybe, I don't know if we will be able to answer both of them. One is a bit long. I will shorten it down a bit. So Ukraine these days is dependent on the different forms of aid and support from EU, and not only that. We maybe even, in a way, have to integrate into all the structures of this union. However, from other perspectives, with which I agree tremendously, we are on the outskirts, in a way, an instrument for European control, symbolical and very much physical, of this part of the continent. Why should we, in a truly meaningful way, sympathize and connect with people from Western Europe? Should we follow this easy path, or should we rather connect with those who suffered from different forms of imperialism and are trying to find their place in this precarious world? And also, is there a way to pragmatically use the resources of the EU without becoming a part of the system of exploitation of other parts of the world? I think this question is maybe formulated a bit radically, but it does speak to what I understood from Daria and Elisa's book, actually, when you were talking, for example, about the fact that we always look for Europeans or for like Westerners in sense of Western institutions, Western spaces to actually talk to each other also across East and South. And maybe that's something that like this kind of you can talk about that as to this question.
Yeah, we were thinking more in terms of like how can we kind of sidestep the Western metropole in our kind of theoretical thinking and think more in terms of how theory travels and how can we think from a more kind of situated politics without constantly returning to the Western metropole for this conceptual baggage. I don't know if Elisa would like to add.
No, I was just thinking in terms a bit more like practical or tactical to approach this question in that way, because there are always, and I think Ukrainians and Ukrainian civil society are particularly competent, from what I understand, in that. So in using and applying European funding, for example, but also pushing a bit the conditions with which it comes. And I think that is always a space that can be used. And it can be used tactically and it can be used. So that doesn't mean that one wouldn't be part of the system of exploitation, of a system of bordering, but still it remains a space that can be negotiated every day. And I think I was really impressed by, for example, the call from Ukrainian humanitarian organizations and the way many of them are mobilized to contest the way in which European funding is, transferred, and the conditions which it requires in terms of reporting and the bureaucracy that comes with it, and how ineffective that is. That was a very powerful challenge to that system, and also it shows a lot of somehow fluency and competence. And I think that can be mobilized by those who want to work, to disturb at least, to push this system in very useful ways, even though, like, of course, the scale of what we do remains often, like, rather local. But yeah, so I think that is, but my question would be not very optimistic if we look at it from, but then there is something that can be done in those cracks. And I think there is a lot that can come from Ukraine and Ukrainian organizations in that sense.
Yes, Alexandra or Etienne? No?
I think I'm okay. I think what Elisa just said exactly also covers what I wanted to say. So thanks for that.
Perfect. Well, then we have time for one last question that we have in the chat. Is there any chance that the European Federation could reconfigure itself facing the challenges of the upcoming right-wing turn in several countries, or we have to count on the dark times?
Count on it. Count on it, because nationalism is on the rise everywhere. So the federal idea that I'm advocating with some others is in an extremely difficult situation today. The only thing I could say very abstractly is that, and that's kind of wishful thinking in a sense, is that the right-wing tendencies are so strong, and they are supported by tendencies at the global level, not only from America and from Russia, but from many other places as well, that, of course, we are facing again. We should try not to use the big words all the time, but like fascist tendencies in our countries. The xenophobia, the racial hatred against. I love your formula. People on the move. in some previous essays, I used the formula, the moving or the mobile part of humankind, which is becoming an important element of our civilizations today. So they are the primary. They are the primary target, or one of the primary targets of this new xenophobia. So and then you could also add other elements. I mean, it's always perilous for a man like me to pretend to offer something like a feminist discourse. But still, I believe that one of the most dangerous and disgusting aspects of this right-wing tendency is the kind of backlash of masculinist values that we observe, and war is part of that, etc. So we could add other elements. So that's a reason to be pessimistic, but also looking at previous historical circumstances, I tend to believe that democratic forces gather and unite and impose something like progressive reforms, and that could include a federal dimension in Europe, when they are precisely confronted with this kind of peril. It's not just that you want to keep something of liberalism, of liberal democracy, defend the rights we have. Is that you face a danger. I'm not convinced that everybody in our societies, intellectuals, teachers, workers, technicians, etc., will pure and simply bow before this right-wing advance. A resistance is bound to emerge, but that's our only chance and hope.
Thank you, Etienne. Does anybody want to add something on this question? Or should we? That was kind of, let's say, at the same time, a cold diagnostic, but also maybe an optimistic or a hopeful ending. And maybe we can finish our panel with that. And so thanks again to all of you for this discussion where we agree but also disagree in productive ways, I believe. And thanks to all of you. And thanks also again to our translators, Ivan and Victoria, for their work. The next panel starts at 5 p.m. And it's going to be on environment.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.